To you both. Maya, quite a disruptive day today for both Jeremy Corbyn and Boris Johnson.
Yeah, I mean, I think you're always going to get this to some extent in the general election campaign. If you look across over history, what you do find is there are moments when members of the public interact with politicians, particularly very senior politicians, and maybe say things where they get the chance to say, we don't particularly agree with you on X, Y, or Z issue. What I think is actually quite interesting is Boris Johnson has been doing a lot of controlled visits. So he's really been trying to avoid the public. And today, when he was, there was protests, he was forced to cancel, reschedule, change his visit in Glasgow. And what you've seen over this campaign is a lot of Conservatives talked about Boris Johnson as this great campaigner, but actually it almost seems that everywhere that Boris Johnson goes, protests follows. So this idea that he is the man of the people, I don't think is really borne out by the evidence, whether that be him going to places that have been flooded, whether that him going to some of the places in Yorkshire where he thinks he's going to be able to pick up some seats. Actually, a lot of people are not happy with what the Conservatives have done over the past 9 years in terms of cuts to some of our vital services. And so I think that's really affecting him in a negative way.
Jonathan, how do you think the party leaders are holding up when they come face to face with voters out on this campaign trail? We saw Jeremy Corbyn heckled yesterday by a gentleman talking about terrorist links. He heckled him, Jeremy Corbyn said nothing and walked away. I mean, when they come up front to these members of the public, how do you think they're doing at the moment?
Well, the fact that you've got both party leaders encountering members of the public who are clearly telling them things that aren't necessarily entirely positive is certainly proof that the party managers on all sides are not controlling them so much that they're not meeting real people. And I think there'd certainly be concern if there was a sense that they were trying to avoid meeting real people. It's interesting how the way these election campaigns have changed over the last couple of decades, really, because 10 or 20 years ago, it was all very formulaic. You'd have a daily press conference at an office in London, and then the leaders would go out on a campaign bus somewhere around the country. But with the advent of social media and a very fast-paced news agenda, obviously helped by channels like Sky News, it's all very pacey, and a lot of the connection between the politicians and voters is actually done through social media. We've seen great use already this campaign of videos on Facebook, on Twitter, where the politicians get to talk directly to the people without even having to go through the middleman of a TV or radio station. Yeah, Mike, that's an interesting point, isn't it? A lot of politicians going to social media. We saw the Conservatives, a very slick campaign video launched yesterday, Boris Johnson making a cup of tea and having a chat to camera about various different issues, interspersed with a few jokey questions. So that's one thing, getting the clean message out on social media. But when they come face to face with members of the public, can be a bit of a risk because cameras are there, it's unfiltered and unscripted.
Yeah, and I think this is when politicians actually really do come under fire for some of the things they've said or done, particularly in terms of policy in recent years. And so what you saw very early on, before the campaign had even really started, you saw Boris Johnson going to a hospital and being confronted with a parent whose child was in that hospital and saying, the hospital is not equipped well enough because of cuts that have been done over the past 9 years. And so what it means is that for a lot of these slick messages that parties have and they roll out through social media, that really comes under fire in terms of the content of what they're saying and just how accurate what they're saying is when they come up against members of the public who've maybe been on the sharp end of experiencing some of those policies.
Jonathan, it's interesting. At the moment, politicians don't necessarily have to worry about members of the public tripping them up on their policies and promises. Some of them are doing a pretty good job at doing that themselves. For instance, Jeremy Corbyn, yesterday on the second Scottish independence referendum, seemed to change his tact 1, 2, 3 times in the course of a day. Also, Labour, when it came to a 4-day week on the NHS, you had the Shadow Health Secretary saying it wouldn't include NHS staff. You then had the Shadow Chancellor later in the day saying it would.
That's right. And of course, Emily Thornberry, the Shadow Foreign Secretary, earlier this week on the biggest issue of the moment, the issue of the election on Brexit, she managed to mix up whether she'd be in favour of leave or remain come a second referendum, which Labour are saying they want to foist on the country next year if they were to win this election. So, yeah, politicians absolutely can be their own worst enemy if they trip up, or indeed if they tell the truth. I mean, there's a big debate going on in Labour today over immigration, which is the subject the Conservatives have been pushing today. And the question is, do Labour or do Labour not believe in continuing freedom of movement after Brexit. Some shadow cabinet members have been on television trying to avoid the question, although the Shadow Home Secretary, Diane Abbott, I haven't seen her on television today, but on Twitter, she said that Labour were committed to maintaining and extending freedom of movement after Brexit, which is a complete U-turn on what they said in their 2017 manifesto.
Well, if Labour tie themselves in knots, how are the Conservatives getting on, Maya? Because they are talking about migration and immigration today. Priti Patel talking about the Australian points system and how it will reduce migration, but she won't say by how much or when, which is what voters want to know.
I mean, I'm actually not that interested in talking about the numbers because I think it's incredibly dehumanising and not that helpful for our debate. We should be treating migrants like people instead of numbers on a sheet. But I do think what the Conservatives have done today is incredibly cynical. So you actually had a press release, Priti Patel saying the Conservatives would reduce immigration. And it just so happens that's on the same day that we have a news that A&E waiting times are a record high since records began, which is because of Conservative cuts. So what it looks like really is the Conservatives scapegoating immigrants once again in order to just detract from the mistakes that they have made. And what's interesting about this is on Friday last week, they were saying the Conservatives' plans are that they will reduce visa costs and make it easier for medics to come to this country. Never mind anyone else who has to pay huge amounts for visas, which far outstrip the amount it costs to process applications. They said they were going to reduce those visa costs because they needed medics to come and work in the NHS. On Monday, you found Michael Gove talking about immigration numbers yet again and saying that immigrants would be bad for public services, bad for the NHS and bad for our schools if there were too many people coming here. And so what you have is this idea again that immigration is a problem when we know that you are far more likely to be treated by a migrant than you are to be behind a migrant in the queue for using the NHS, for instance. And what they are doing is they're trying to blame immigrants for all kinds of issues in society. It isn't immigration that means your child can't get a school place. It isn't immigration that it means you're going to have to wait in A&E for hours and hours on hospital beds to be waited to be seen by a doctor. And they are blaming immigrants once again, even as we still have people who have not been compensated because of the mistakes that were made in the hostile environment for the Windrush generation. And so I think it's incredibly cynical and incredibly damaging.
OK, my good fellow and Jonathan Isby, thank you very much. The devil, as always, is